You can't just stand there, help me. Jessa's voice cracked, raw with panic, as she stumbled into the yard clutching the quivering shepherd by its collar. The dog's fur was matted in soot, ash clinging to its ears, and its eyes, bright, were clouded with something darker. For a heartbeat, her partner Eli just stared, his wrench hanging loose in one hand, as if the tools in front of him suddenly belonged to another life. The morning had started quietly enough in their remote cabin on the edge of Highvale Forest, the frost still clinging stubbornly to the grass despite the late spring sun. But now the air seemed heavier, as if it carried something unspoken from the tree line. Eli knelt, his hand brushing over the dog's flank, feeling the tremor beneath its skin. "This isn't just smoke," he muttered. The dog's paw pads were raw, caked with a layer of blackened earth. Somewhere in that forest where no roads reached and no neighbors lived, something had burned. Not a campfire, not a brush clearing, something big. Jessa's mind raced as she fetched a basin of water, her hands shaking as she tried to rinse the soot away. Every splash turned the water gray, swirling with tiny black flecks. She had grown up here, knew every path and clearing, for miles, but in all her life the forest had been a constant green, quiet, alive. Seeing a piece of it carried back on their dog felt like holding a fragment of something broken. The shepherd, named Bran, had disappeared hours earlier on his usual morning run. He never came back in this state before, never silent, never limping, never with that haunted look, and the smell. Beneath the sharp tang of burnt wood was something else, something sour and metallic that tightened Jessa's chest. Eli's gaze kept drifting to the shadowed edge of the woods, where the tree swayed gently in the wind, hiding whatever lay beyond. He wanted to grab the rifle, to follow Bran's trail right then. But something in the dog's posture, tail, low eyes darting toward the trees, made him hesitate. Whatever Bran had seen, whatever he had run from, it wasn't over. The forest loomed like a wall, its quiet far too deep for a spring morning. No bird calls, no rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. Just stillness. Jessa's breath caught as Bran shifted, his nose pointing toward the west ridge, the muscles in his body tensing as if he expected something to emerge. And then she heard it faint, muffled, like wood cracking under weight. One sound, then silence. Eli met her eyes, his voice low. "We need to see what's out there." Bran took a step toward the trees, ash falling from his coat like snow, and deep in her chest, Jessa felt it, that quiet pull between dread and duty. The knowledge that whatever waited in the forest had already touched their lives, they just didn't know how deeply yet. The forest felt wrong from the moment they stepped beneath its canopy. Even the sunlight seemed reluctant to enter, filtering through the branches in narrow, fractured beams. Bran padded ahead, every muscle in his lean frame taut, his nose sweeping the ground as if searching for something that wasn't entirely there anymore. Jessa followed close behind, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the flashlight she had brought. Even though it was still midday, Eli moved in measured strides, the rifle resting against his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows. The first thing they noticed was the smell, thicker now, no longer diluted by the wind. It wrapped around them in a heavy shroud. Smoke, mixed with that sharp metallic tang that made the back of Jessa's throat tighten. It was the scent of something unnatural, a reminder that the forest didn't burn on its own in this season. Somewhere ahead, a crow let out a broken caw before falling silent again, its wings snapping through the air as it vanished into the distance. Bran slowed, his paws pressing into a layer of soft ash that had settled on the forest floor like a thin snowfall. Jessa crouched and touched it. It was still faintly warm. That was when she saw it, a small paw print, not Bran's. Too delicate for a wolf, too narrow for a lynx. She traced it with her fingertip, her mind searching for an answer, but before she could speak, Eli's voice broke the silence. "Jessa, look at this." He was standing near a fallen log, its bark blackened and curling away from the wood. Embedded in its charred surface were deep Gooch's claw marks, long and deliberate. Not the random scraping of an animal in panic, but the kind of marks left when something wanted to be remembered. The sight of them sent an involuntary shiver up her spine. Bran winked, his head low, his ears flicking back and forth as though he was hearing something they couldn't. They pressed on, following the dog's lead as the ash grew thicker, crunching softly underfoot. The trees began to change, their trunks scorched to a deep, lifeless black. Here and there, smoke still rose from the ground in thin, ghostly wisps. It should have been the aftermath of a fire, but there was no spread pattern, no ring of destruction. It looked as though something had moved through in a straight line, leaving this path of ruin behind. Jessa's pulse quickened as they emerged into a small clearing. The earth here was scorched in a perfect circle, the center strangely bare, stripped of grass, leaves, even insects. At its heart lay a mound of disturbed soil. The ground bulged upward, as though something had been buried hastily. She glanced at Eli, her voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't make sense." Eli took a step forward, crouching to press his palm to the mound. His hand recoiled almost instantly. "It's warm," he said, his voice rough, and there was something in his eyes that Jessa didn't like, an unease she had only seen once before. Years ago, when they'd found a hiker after a winter storm. He stood, scanning the tree line. "We need to know what's under here." Before she could answer, Bran let out a sharp guttural bark and darted toward the far edge of the clearing. Jessa turned in time to see something shift between the trees, a flicker of pale movement, too quick to define. The air seemed to thicken, every sound magnified. The crunch of ash under their boots, the soft hiss of wind through burned branches, the dog's rapid breathing. Eli raised the rifle slightly but didn't fire. They followed Bran into the denser trees, and with every step, Jessa felt a mounting pressure in her chest, a sense that they were walking into the center of something they weren't meant to witness. Then, without warning, the ground dropped away into a shallow ravine. At the bottom lay the twisted remains of what must have been a hunting camp. Charred tents collapsed into themselves. Metal pots warped and blackened, a lantern split clean in half as if crushed under something heavy. Jessa slid down the slope, her boots slipping on the loose soil. She picked up a piece of scorched fabric and froze when she noticed the faint outline of a handprint in ash across it, too large to be human, yet eerily shaped like one. Her throat tightened. She could feel Eli watching her, waiting for her to say what they were both thinking, but she couldn't bring herself to put it into words. Bran moved through the wreckage with a low whine, circling around a dark patch of earth. When Jessa reached him, she saw that the ground there was singed in an uneven pattern, as though whatever had touched it had burned in strange, branching lines. At the center of the scorch was something small and silver, half buried in dirt. She dug it out carefully, brushing away the ash until a shape emerged, a locket, tarnished but intact. It was warm to the touch. Inside, under the soot, was a photograph of a man and a young girl, their faces blurred by time and smoke. Jessa's stomach knotted as she realized she had seen them before, not in person, but on a missing persons flyer posted months ago in the nearest town. The forest seemed to close in around them then, the weight of the silence pressing harder. The smell was stronger now, almost suffocating. Eli glanced toward the ridge above the ravine, his eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," he said. Jessa followed his gaze, her breath catching as she spotted it just for a moment, outlined in the haze. A tall figure standing perfectly still among the trees, its shape distorted by the wavering heat rising from the ground. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Bran's growl rumbled low in his chest. Jessa's grip tightened around the locket as if it might anchor her to something real, but her heart was already pounding with the certainty that whatever had burned this place was not finished, and somewhere, deep in the forest, it was still moving. Bran's pace slowed as they pushed deeper into Highvale Forest, his paw prints sinking into a fine layer of ash that seemed to have no clear origin. The morning light filtered through the canopy and fractured shafts, revealing flecks of dust that drifted like pale embers in the still air. Eli kept his rifle slung but ready, his eyes scanning the undergrowth for any sign of movement. Jessa followed close, her heart pounding in a rhythm that matched the crunch of their boots on the brittle forest floor. Every so often, Bran would stop abruptly, ears pricked, body rigid, his gaze fixed on some unseen point ahead. It was as though he was leading them, not toward a discovery, but back into the memory of something terrible. They passed through an area where the scent of smoke thickened, clinging to their clothes, catching in their throats. The ash underfoot was deeper here, coating the moss and curling leaves in a thin, unnatural frost. Jessa reached down and ran her fingers through it, her stomach tightening at the realization it wasn't just wood ash. Embedded in it were darker fragments, brittle, yet dense, that she couldn't quite place. She wanted to ask Eli what he thought, but the look on his face set grim told her not to break the silence. The forest began to change. The vibrant greens dulled into a muted palette, the air cooling despite the climb in the sun's arc. Ahead, the trees thinned into a small clearing, but the ground there was blackened in irregular patterns, as though the fire had licked through selectively, leaving some branches untouched while others were consumed entirely. Bran winced softly, circling a spot where the earth was churned and dented, as if something had fought to either escape or bury itself. Then Jessa saw it half hidden in the ash, a scrap of fabric no bigger than her palm. She bent to pick it up, brushing away soot to reveal faded red, the kind of red you'd see on a child's mitten or scarf. Her breath hitched. Eli, she started, but before she could finish, Bran let out a sharp bark and darted toward the far side of the clearing. They followed, the ground rising slightly until it broke into a ridge overlooking a steep drop. What lay below made Jessa's knees weaken. The slope was scarred with black gouges, and at its base was the splintered frame of something man-made. It wasn't a cabinta small, too crude, but rather a wooden structure now collapsed in on itself. Around it, the soil was disrupted, as though animals or desperate hands had clawed through it. Eli crouched, studying the scene, his voice low but certain. This wasn't a natural fire. Look at the burn lines, too controlled, too deliberate. He gestured toward the perimeter, where blackened logs lay arranged almost like a barrier. The thought that someone could have built this, then burned it, sent a chill through Jessa deeper than the air itself. Bran nosed at something near the structure, pawing the ground until he uncovered another object, a metal tin, scorched but still intact. Eli pried it open carefully, and the smell that escaped was unlike anything Jessa had known, a mix of charred wood, damp earth, and something pungent, chemical. Inside were fragments of paper, too blackened to read fully, but one corner still held a legible marker drawing, crude but unmistakable, of a circle with lines radiating outward. It looked almost like a sun, or a symbol. Before they could study it further, a sound drifted from deeper in the forest. Not the brittle snap of branches under an animal's weight, but something heavier, slower. A dragging noise, accompanied by the faintest metallic rattle. Eli stiffened, motioning for Jessa to stay back, but Bran had already turned toward the sound, muscles taut. The noise grew clearer, and with it came the unsettling realization that it was moving toward them. Jessa's thoughts spun wildly. If the fire wasn't an accident, then whoever set it might still be out here. And if they were, they had just found traces of something that personal people might not want discovered. She felt the air thicken with the weight of being somewhere they shouldn't be, of trespassing into a story that belonged to the forest long before they stepped into it. The dragging stopped. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, from beyond the ridge, a figure appeared partially obscured by the trees, moving with a limping gait. They couldn't make out details through the distance and the haze of ash still drifting from the ground, but the way the figure carried itself was wrong. It was hunched, its head tilted toward the earth as though searching for something lost. Bran growled low in his throat, his stance firm but wary. Eli tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes never leaving the figure. The person, if it was a person, paused, then slowly turned in their direction. Even from where they stood, Jessa felt the weight of that gaze, an unspoken recognition that they had been seen. The figure raised one arm, not in greeting, but in a slow, deliberate motion, as if pointing to the charred remains behind them. Then, without a word, it turned and began moving back into the deeper shadows of the forest. The dragging sound fading with each step. Jessa's pulse pounded in her ears. Eli, what did we just see? She whispered, but no answer came. The wind shifted, carrying with it a new smell, faint, almost sweet, yet unmistakably tied to the burned clearing. Bran wind again, the ash falling from his coat in thin clouds as he backed toward them. Whatever they had stumbled into wasn't finished. The forest had only just begun to show its truth. Jessa could feel the ground change beneath her boots as they climbed the western ridge, each step sinking into a damp layer of ash that muffled their movements. The air was thicker here, laced with the acrid bite of smoke that clung to the back of her throat. Bran moved ahead in short bursts, sniffing, circling, then darting forward again, as if pulled by a scent that was both familiar and terrifying. The forest around them had shifted from the green they knew into something skeletal, blackened trunks rising like charred bones, branches stripped bare and reaching skyward as though in silent protest. Eli's jaw was tight, his grip on the rifle firm but restless. He had been in these woods his whole life, had hunted here, worked here, even slept under the canopy on summer nights. But he had never seen this ridge burn, not in memory, not in the old stories passed down from his father. Fire was rare in Highvale, too wet, too dense to let flames travel far. Whatever happened here was recent, fierce and purposeful. He could feel it in the unnatural stillness, the absence of the usual forest chorus. Even the wind moved differently, whistling through hollowed trunks with a low, mournful hum. The deeper they went, the more it felt as if the forest itself had recoiled from something. The ground was littered with fragments of what once lived here: charred pine cones, cracked bird eggs, and scorched feathers plastered against the earth. Jessa's chest tightened each time she spotted movement in the corner of her eye, only to find it was ash, drifting lazily through stray beams of sunlight. But Bran's urgency never faltered. His tail stayed low, his ears pinned back, and his paws barely paused as he crossed into a small clearing ahead. Jessa stepped in after him, and froze. The clearing was ringed by scorched oaks, their trunks blackened but still standing, encircling a space where the ground was sunken in the center, as if something had been ripped from it. The earth there was not just burned, it was hollow, the ash coating a strange depression, its edges smoothed unnaturally. Eli moved in cautiously, eyes scanning the tree line, but Jessa was drawn to the center. She knelt, brushing her fingers across the surface, and felt a brittle layer give way beneath her touch. Underneath was something pale and warped, almost bone-like but not quite. A sound carried through the trees, then sharp and fast, like something snapping back into place. Bran stiffened, his head jerking toward the north slope. Eli's gaze followed, and for a moment Jessa thought she saw a flicker of movement in the shadows. A figure. Maybe, though it was too quick to be sure. A shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you run. It was the kind that rooted you, the kind that whispered that leaving too quickly would draw attention. Eli motioned for her to stay low as he moved to the edge of the clearing. His voice was a low murmur, more to himself than to her. This isn't just fire. Someone's been here. The way he said it, with a weight that seemed to press the air thinner, made her believe it. She had imagined lightning, or some freak accident, but this felt arranged, controlled. They began to back away, Bran pacing between them, the tension in his body like a wire drawn too tight. But before they reached the shelter of the trees, a gust of wind shifted the ash, revealing something in the center of the hollow, a fragment of cloth half buried, singed along the edges but still clinging to its original deep green. It wasn't forest debris, it wasn't natural. Jess's fingers curled around it, and the fabric was warm to warm for how long the fire should have been out. She stood there, holding it, feeling its damp weight, while the forest seemed to close in again. Bran whimpered, a soft, almost human sound, and Eli reached for her elbow. "We can't stay here." His voice had no trace of hesitation now, only urgency. But as they turned to leave, the wind shifted once more, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong, a faint, rhythmic pounding, like distant footsteps. Neither of them looked back, but Jessa knew, even without seeing, that whatever had driven Bran home in silence was still out here watching, waiting, and far from finished. They broke from the ridge as the last light began to fade, the sky dimming into a bruised wash of purple and gray. Bran led the way, no longer darting ahead but keeping close, his flank brushing Jess's leg, as though afraid to lose contact. Every step away from the hollow felt heavier, as if the forest wanted to keep them there. Eli didn't speak, but his eyes kept sweeping the darkening trees. His shoulders tensed until the tree line thinned and their cabin roof came into view. Only then did his pace slow down. The world felt smaller, safer, though the smell of ash still clung to their clothes. Jessa spread the green fabric on the table, its edges curling slightly from heat. In the lamp's glow, faint stitching appeared, letters half burned, impossible to read. Her mind turned over questions faster than her mouth could form them. Who had been out there? What had they left behind? And why did it feel as if the fire wasn't meant to destroy but to hide? Eli eased into the chair opposite her, his hands rough from years of work but steady now as they rested on the table. "Whatever it was," he said quietly, "it's not just ours to solve." His voice carried a weight she understood. The forest had its own truths, its own secrets, and not all of them were meant to be dragged into the open. Some would linger, in the quiet, known only by the trees that had seen them. Bran lay by the door, his breathing slow, his body finally easing from its taut readiness. Jessa watched him, remembering the way he had come barreling out of the tree line hours ago, mute, trembling, covered in ash. He had carried back more than just the scent of fire. He had carried back the forest's warning, and maybe that was all they needed to understand for now. When the night deepened and the wind began to stir through the pines, Jessa stepped out onto the porch. The ridge was hidden in darkness, but the scent of smoke had faded, replaced by the sharp, clean air she had always known here. Somewhere beyond sight, the clearing still waited, holding its unanswered questions beneath a blanket of ash. She knew they could go back tomorrow, or the day after, but some part of her doubted they ever would. The forest wasn't just where they lived, it was part of who they were. It could be beautiful and cruel, generous and unforgiving, and sometimes it reminded you just how small you were within it. Bran shifted inside, his nails clicking softly against the floor, and she felt a quiet gratitude for his return, for the way he had bridged the distance between what they could see and what they could only sense. She let the night air fill her lungs, the coolness steadying her. The ridge might burn again, the forest might change, but tonight their home still stood, and their dogs still lay breathing at their feet. And in that fragile balance between what was lost and what was saved, there was something worth holding on to.